The Swiss National Bank surprised everyone again, this time by cutting interest rates by 50 basis points rather than 25 basis points as expected. Not only that, newly installed central bank chief Martin Schlegel threatened to take rates negative if he has to. Now, why would he have to? Deflationary potential. Because this is Switzerland, that means global factors too. The Swiss had a message back in March when they were the first major central bank to begin cutting rates. And it was a warning to other central bankers and the entire global economy, one that has already proven to have been correct. And while everyone 9 months ago was all worried about sticky inflation and maybe higher for longer, some Fed officials were talking about maybe more rate hikes in the US, the Swiss National Bank, all the way back in March, in effect, told the world to ignore all of that noise. The risks were instead tilting to the downside in terms of economy as well as consumer prices. And where it would come to consumer prices, the risk was undershooting, and not solely in Switzerland. So the S&P started cutting way back in March because they were anticipating what other central banks were going to be doing before any other central bankers had known it. I even published a video back on March 21st talking about that first shock Swiss rate cut. And in it, I said this.
At least one of the world's major central banks isn't conflicted about consumer prices. The Swiss made a bold move earlier today, though for reasons hardly anyone is going to like. They said we aren't the least bit concerned about inflation. Instead, it's what's happening around the rest of the world that has forced them to act. Now, earlier we'd expected them to sell francs to do something about the escalating situation in the currency. Maybe thinking about a rate cut later on this year, but they went for the rate cut right out of the gate. Compare the Swiss National Bank and what they're doing to the Federal Reserve, and yesterday it's absolutely confused dot mess. The Swiss have a message for the Fed, the ECB, and everyone else. We know you're going to be cutting rates and maybe be cutting them by a lot.
We know you're going to be cutting rates and maybe by a lot. That's right where the world is right now. Even while some struggle yet again with how disinflation doesn't go in a straight line. Just yesterday, as expected, given the surge in unemployment in Canada, the Bank of Canada and Tiff Macklem, they did their second straight 50 basis point rate cut. Today, in addition to the Swiss, we have the ECB. And while they only did 25, it was the so-called dovish one. And the markets over there are still forecasting a 50 over the next couple meetings anyway. The question is only when. Even Denmark cut its benchmark interest rates. And just to confirm why central bankers are actually doing this, OPEC lowered their forecast for global oil demand for the 5th straight month, and by the most this time around, as if something major has changed in the global economy since around mid-year, or really since the Swiss National Bank kicked off this rate-cutting cycle back in March. And as the Swiss are cutting by 50 now and accelerating their cuts and talking about maybe even negative rates, that's something you need to pay attention to. That's what really stuck out way back in March, because as the Swiss were cutting, everyone else was talking about being hawkish and consumer prices and everything. The Swiss said, no way. Our forecasts show that consumer prices in Switzerland, because of global factors, are at risk of undershooting tremendously from where we would like them to be. In fact, they've actually been proven to have been too conservative in their forecast, because consumer prices in Switzerland, as I'll get to in just a moment, have gone even further below where they thought they would. In fact, they're at risk of maybe even turning negative early next year as all of the markets begin to price global recession probabilities that are consistent with what the Swiss are saying in their consumer price forecast. So fast forward to today, December 12th. According to the policy statement put out by the Swiss National Bank, it said the Swiss National Bank is lowering the S&P policy rate by 0.5 percentage point to 0.5 percentage point. The new policy rate applies from tomorrow, December 13th. Bank sight deposits held at the S&P will be remunerated at S&P policy rate up to a certain threshold and at 0% above that threshold. Standard stuff for the S&P. Here's the thing. The S&P also remains willing to be active in the foreign exchange market as necessary because the Swiss franc has been stronger. And the reason why the Swiss franc has been stronger It's the other side of weak currencies around the world. It's the twin, so to speak, to the rising US dollar. Risk aversion, flight to safety. Everyone goes to Switzerland when things are looking bad around the rest of the world, and the Swiss don't necessarily like that. In the shorter term, the new conditional inflation forecast is below that of September, quite a bit below it too. This, above all, reflects the lower than expected inflation in the case of oil products and food. We'll talk about oil in just a minute. Thanks to the policy rate cut today, there is little change in the medium term, which is an assumption. The new forecast is within the range of price stability over the forecast horizon. It puts average annual inflation around 1.1% this year, 0.3%, very low next year, and then back to 0.8% for 2026. This forecast is based on the assumption that the S&B policy rate is 0.5% over the forecast horizon, the new rate that they just instituted today. Without today's rate cut, the conditional inflation forecast would have been lower. So they're already presuming that rate cuts are going to work and help keep inflation from undershooting too much to the point that it goes potentially negative next year. And that's quite of a leap of an assumption, because despite the fact that Swiss National Bank has been cutting rates since March already, consumer price rates continue to go down and down and down. So consumer price forecasts from the central bank continue to go down and down and down, as if they're not responding whatsoever to the Swiss National Bank's rate policy, and instead are focused and responding exclusively to global factors. Switzerland is a bellwether, and it is a bellwether warning, just like it was to central bankers 9 months ago. I mean, speaking of global factors, that's something that Jim Rickards and I talked about at our webinar. The webinar is still available for replay if you're interested. And we had a pretty long and spirited discussion about what's really wrong in the world and what we might be able to do about it. Not just about government debt, but the history of money, the flexibility of money, a whole bunch of different topics. So if you're interested in talking about global factors, there's a replay of our webinar. There's a link in the description to find that. Just looking through their conditional inflation forecast. If you go back to last December, their December 2023 projections had the third quarter of 2024, so the just completed quarter earlier, at 2%. And that was rising from a little bit of a dip earlier in the year. And then they had the conditional inflation projection leveling off at 1.6% by the second quarter of next year. So everything looked like it was a smooth trajectory and a smooth ride into what they consider their long-run stable tendency. But then by March, they began to reduce their forecast, which is why they started cutting rates back in March. They had forecast in March, the third quarter of 2024, at just 1.5%, which is down 0.5% from where they were just a couple months before. Now, in March, they thought they would level off at 1.2% by early next year. Fast forward to September, more reductions in the forecast because consumer prices kept undershooting to their projections. So in September, for the third quarter of this year, they thought what was 2% back in December and 1.5% back in March, all the way down to 1.1%. Now in September, they're forecasting consumer price rate to level off at 0.5% by the second quarter of next year, and then modestly rise because of additional rate cuts to 0.7% in 2026. But now they've thrown that out the window. The latest projections they just put out today shows the fourth quarter of this year, the one we're in now, at just 0.7%, dropping all the way to 0.2% by the second quarter of next year, that continues to be the spot on these curves I've been talking, SOFR curve, Euribor curve, the window between March of 2025 and June. That continues to be the spot where the markets are pricing the maximum amount of global economic and financial risk. And here's the Swiss National Bank forecast basically saying the same thing in the language of central bankers, which is consumer price rates. They now expect the consumer price rate in Switzerland to drop to just 0.2% in the second quarter of next year, which is why they did the 50 basis point rate cut, because they believe rate cuts will help it from not going negative. That's what they're trying to avoid. Even a small negative for a short period of time, for very good reasons, is something you don't want to see in any economy, because it not only does it suggest there's a huge amount of weakness in the economy, it also, once you get to be that weak, getting out of that situation, as we've known throughout the 2010s, we've experienced it throughout the 2010s, is incredibly difficult. So the 50 basis point rate cut is because all of these global factors, recession factors, disinflation, even deflationary factors, are conspiring to threaten Switzerland with a bout of deflation early next year. And here's the thing, though. Speaking on CNBC earlier today, Martin Schlegel, who's the new head of the Swiss National Bank, taking over from Thomas Jordan, who was the longtime head through the last decade plus, he told Carolyn Roth of CNBC that with this rate cut, negative interest rates have become less likely in the future because they continue to believe that rate cuts are effective. Even though they've missed on all of their forecasts this entire time where they've been cutting rates. Rate cuts only work in their models. And because they're assumed to work in their models, they can get on TV and say that rate cuts work. It's a circular reasoning. In fact, just to digress here a little bit, in June of 2019, in a brief moment of clarity, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell actually said that. I mean, he basically came out and said, what he said was, in models, great confidence in central bankers is achieved by assumption. So here's the Swiss National Bank had Martin Schlegel doing exactly the same thing, saying, we're going to avoid negative consumer price. We're going to avoid deflation. We're going to avoid having to go into negative interest rates because we expect and we assume that rate cuts will be effective. When the experience of modern history, as well as just more recently in Switzerland, shows that rate cuts haven't done anything to support the economy, nor keep consumer prices from threatening to turn deflationary. A lot of this has to do with the Swiss franc. As I said, the Swiss franc tends to rise during risk-off periods or risk aversion, flight to safety. When everything looks bad when everything looks bad around the world, which increasingly it does, a lot of demand for safe haven, and Switzerland is considered one of the best of those. So the franc tends to rise as a flight to safety type of situation. And the Swiss National Bank, that contributes to weak consumer prices, but as a reflection of all of these global factors. So the global economy gets to be worse and worse and worse and perceived to be worse and worse and worse. Flight to safety, Swiss franc goes up. Swiss consumer prices go down. The Swiss National Bank has to react to them. So the Swiss National Bank is at the end of a process, at the end of a relatively long line of factors. The Swiss National Bank action is about what's happening on the rest of the world. So the rest of the world gets weak, Swiss franc rises, consumer price rates in Switzerland go down, the Swiss National Bank has to react to them, which is what it's doing. And in addition to cutting rates, Martin Schlegel said that they will, if they have to, go into negative rates to maintain that the franc doesn't go too high or higher than they would like it to. And after the surprise 50 basis point cut was announced in Switzerland, the Swiss franc briefly did fall to what was a two-week low. But then it turned right around. As Bloomberg reported earlier today, the franc briefly fell to a two-week low versus the euro after the Swiss National Bank surprised markets by delivering a larger than expected half-point cut on Thursday, a move designed to stem the franc's recent strength. But the currency quickly rebounded and was unperturbed even after S&B President Martin Schlegel repeated his threat to bring rates to negative territory if warranted. Because the central banks at the end of the day are just reacting to stuff, not actually manipulating markets. They're reacting to the global weakness that is causing the franc to rise, therefore consumer prices in Switzerland to fall. That's all that's happening. They're not actually about to turn the franc around. The franc is going to keep going so long as there's risk aversion and problems around the rest of the world, which those are only growing. And we can see that in any number of ways. China, anyone? One of those ways is specifically about the rest of the world, global demand, OPEC. OPEC has been talking about restarting their production that was cut back all the way back in 2022 when the world was supposed to be recovering then. They pushed them back. They've pushed them back, I believe, 3 straight times now to April of next year. So OPEC continues to struggle with the idea that demand isn't there. In fact, they've reduced their forecast for global growth in oil demand precipitously in this latest month, but this 5th time in a row. CNBC wrote, the OPEC Plus, quote, precautionary decision to postpone crude production hikes until after the first quarter buys the group time to assess developments in global demand, European growth, which is weak, and the U.S. economy, which is showing signs of labor market deterioration, at least according to the coalition's chair, our favorite, our buddy, Saudi Energy Minister Abdulaziz bin Salman. And all of this sounds exactly like what central banks are doing and what the current SNB head, Martin Schlegel, is talking about. It's one thing corroborating the other. So back in March, the Swiss National Bank started cutting rates, saying, we're cutting rates because we know all the rest of the world's central bankers are going to have to do the same thing and do so probably aggressively. Not only is that what's happened, we see it in a whole bunch of different ways, including the fact that OPEC, which would love to restart production, can't do it because demand continues to get weaker and weaker and weaker. It's all talking about and pointing to the same thing, and it's not inflation. Next door to Switzerland, over in Europe, the ECB, while they cut rates by 25 basis points, they were openly discussing a 50. And as I said in the introduction, markets are pricing that there will be a 50 from the ECB over the next couple of meetings. Why? Well, Europe, it's more obvious than it is in other places like perhaps the United States, where focus is on all of the wrong things. But Europe, very clearly the economy there is struggling. And as well, beyond that, consumer price rates in Europe, especially in certain key countries like France and Germany, have already well undershoot the ECB's target. Not that those targets matter at all because they can never actually hit them. And undershooting is just a description of weakness in the economy from the language of central bankers. So the ECB cut by 25 basis points. That's the fourth cut so far this year, the third straight meeting of cutting 25 basis points. But notably, the ECB committee decided they were going to remove the language that suggested that rates were going to remain sufficiently restrictive. So in other words, they're saying they're expecting a lot more interest rate reductions to come. The fear is that subpar growth drags inflation, currently 2.3% below target. Like I said, it's actually below target in the larger economies. Recalling the pre-COVID era when the focus was more on perking up prices than restraining them. So again, that's just exactly what we're talking about with the Swiss National Bank. The danger of undershooting, getting into too much disinflation rather than too much. And too much disinflation focused on early part of next year, which is where everything seems to be on a collision course. Back to the article. New quarterly projections from the ECB published this Thursday, today, reflect the fragile backdrop, revising down the outlook for economic expansion and inflation next year. Just see what Switzerland has been saying. And again, Switzerland called it way back in March. They said, you're all going to be cutting rates and probably aggressively. So while everyone is talking about consumer prices and inflation risks, we're forecasting the opposite, which is turning out to be true. So we've got rate cuts all over the world, even though in the US anyway, the inflation yo-yo for some people appears to be back on the sticky side, even though consumer prices in the US, they're not sticky. They just don't go in a straight line. We do this every couple of months. The CPI goes down, everybody recognizes disinflation, and then it bounces back higher, which is normal and typical. There's nothing meaningful about it, and everybody goes back into sticky CPI. We were doing this in March when the Swiss started cutting rates, and you should have listened to the Swiss, which suggests strongly you should be listening to the Swiss today. And what they're saying today is that while they have been conservative in their consumer price forecast for all of these global factors, they now realize they were too conservative. The risks to the downside were much greater than they anticipated just a couple months ago. So now they're cutting by 50 basis points, worried, very much worried, that in Switzerland itself, there is a high risk of actual deflation, outright deflation in Switzerland, as the Swiss franc continues to rise. And the Swiss franc continues to rise because of what OPEC was talking about in cutting back and holding back on oil production. Demand isn't there, and it's getting worse. And why is demand not there, getting worse? Because the entire global economy is doing exactly what we see from the perspective of Switzerland. They shocked by cutting rates in March, kicking off this rate cutting cycle. They shocked here in December, saying we aren't even close to done. Canada cut by 50 basis points. That was expected because the Canadian labor market, which looks a lot like the US, but a lot weaker than the US, well, at least that's what we talked about in the video link below. As always, thank you very much for joining me. Huge thank you, Eurodollar University members and subscribers. And until next time, take care.